and welcome. Today we're going to make a really cool garment, the 18th century embroidered men's waistcoat, but for me. During the late 18th century, the time period around where Marie Antoinette was getting really unpopular in France, the 1780s, fashion was, in a word, nuts. To be clear, I am a doctor and a hobbyist, not a historian.
Look, I'm a doctor, not an escalator.
So I'm inviting someone who is an expert on men's 18th century waistcoats onto this show to talk about it, Zack Pinsent. But more on that later. I feel like, expert or not, anyone can see that fashion during the 1780s was just really kind of all over the place. It was so fun and whimsical. Skirts were moving up and getting polonazed. Hair was getting teased and hedgehogged. Waistlines were going up and down, and men's fashion was no different. In particular, I love this era for waistcoats because while we think of embroidery as being naturalistic, beautiful, and floral, and serious, and they certainly did have embroidery that was very serious, there were other embroidery that was nuts. Like, embroidery on these waistcoats got absolutely ridiculous. Check out this pattern for a very psychedelic waistcoat that I have in one of my books. Balloons, because ballooning was all the rage since the first flight was in 1783. Or a jaguar, biting another jaguar is because the truth is, embroidery is just drawing with thread. And you really can just about draw anything you want with thread, just as you can with pencil. It doesn't have to be so serious. So why not have fun with it? I just love this attitude so much. I've been doing it for years. I've tried to interject whimsy into my own embroidery whenever possible. When I made my son a court suit, I made his with Pepperidge Farm goldfish, his favorite snack at the time, embroidered along the border. For the court suit that I attempted to make him when he turned 2, I actually hid gummy bears, his favorite snack at the age of 2, amidst the flowers, including an evil gummy bear planning evil gummy bear deeds. Sadly, he refused to try on the court suit for fittings, and I had to scrap that project because it was getting nowhere. About 2-3 years ago, I found this particular waistcoat in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. I love that this has a story. It has a crane pulling something from the throat of a wolf. It's actually based on the old Aesop tale of a crane that pulled out a bone from a wolf's throat. A dangerous task on the promise of a handsome reward. At the end, the wolf does not give the crane any reward, and the moral is that you shouldn't expect rewards for serving the wicked. Which I have to wonder, was this like a political statement or a giant F you to someone else?
Oh, I like that. I mean, that is so the sort of, like, you could wear it to Parliament or something. And,
yes!
And it's such like a middle finger, you know, like, it's a way of going, oh, this? Well, it's not about you, but if the shoe fits, you know.
I just thought this was so cool. I wanted to make myself this waistcoat, but in my case, I wanted to replace the wolf with something I felt very strongly about, my dogs. I love my 2 American Eskimos named Elspeth and Giddy. They were found under an abandoned house eating a dead deer. We adopted them together, and they've been an essential member of the family ever since. And you may notice them prancing with dignity around me whenever I'm doing photo shoots outside. They are the most dignified of dogs. I decided to take the embroidery of the wolf and turn it into my dogs. So I got a picture of Gideon, mostly because Elspeth tends to sit in a less dignified manner, and drew it out myself using layers of different colored white and beige and cream threads to reflect the fur of the wolf. I also love the flowers along the border, so I also digitized those. And then I had the files ready to go. Now, before I start embroidering this and talk more about the construction of a transitional waistcoat, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, HelloFresh. I've honestly been using one meal delivery service or another non-stop since I've been a resident physician, and I can't tell you how much of a time and lifesaver it has been. This means that instead of having to think of a meal plan for the week, go to the grocery store, pick up the groceries, do the shopping, and then figure out what to do with the excess ingredients of each thing. I get a set of balanced and healthy meals, perfectly proportioned, delivered once a week. It's a time and sanity saver. Moreover, as guilty as I frequently feel about the carbon footprint of getting food delivered, a study by the University of Michigan actually showed that due to decreased waste and the way that meal delivery services source their ingredients, a meal delivery kit actually has 25% less of a carbon footprint than the equivalent grocery store meal, including the plastic. It's a really interesting study, so I've linked it below for those of you who want to read it. Moreover, while I actually really enjoy cooking, they have meals with different time commitments. So on weeks where I know that I'll have to be at the hospital late into the evenings and work a lot of 24-hour shifts, I tend to pick faster meals from their quick and easy options, and it helps a lot that the meals are so delicious that even my toddler can be persuaded to eat it and even try new things like couscous. If you're interested in trying it out, go to HelloFresh.com and use code SOSTEAM14 for up to 14 free meals and 3 free gifts. Thank you again to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Now let's get to the embroidering. Now that I have a base design, I stitched it out and made sure I liked it. I loved it. Even in cheap polyester threads, I knew that it was going to be absolutely perfect. So I ordered some silk threads for the final version, but while I was doing that, I started to work on the waistcoat pattern itself. When I'm making an embroidered waistcoat, I don't just place the designs and then cut it out. If you look at an actual 18th and 19th century embroidered waistcoat, it's clear that they had a waistcoat pattern and then embroidered the designs onto the pattern following the border, including making sure that the border embroidery went all around the edges to follow it just precisely. That's not to say that people always embroider just for you. You can see examples of this at the Met, which are like embroidered kits for waistcoats. You have the long upper panel here, and then you have the angled piece below. This seam would then be covered by the pocket. Very clever and a really lovely way of doing embroidery and yet still making it customized for people. In my case, I am making the waistcoat specifically for me, and to do that, I needed a waistcoat pattern for me. So while I was making this pattern, I find myself constantly texting Zack Pinsent for help. So I asked him to pop on to a Zoom with me to discuss this so you could hear from the expert himself all about the history of the transitional waistcoat and why it looks the way that it does.
Well, to understand the transitional waistcoat, you need to understand what it's transitioning from and why. We have here an original waistcoat from the sort of 1770s, 1780s. This style of waistcoat, whether it be embroidered or plain or with braid on or what have you, this is the predominating style of waistcoat of the 18th century with the pointed bottom and the scalloped pocket flap. This is what we have. And then you have the whole French Revolution thingy. So then there's this whole movement of, okay, where's society going? Things are shifting in royalty. So we're not taking our cues from royalty anymore. And we want to sort of distinguish ourselves a little bit. Europe is a bit all in flux. It's very much a French fashion to start with, but then it catches on like wildfire. So it starts off with basically getting rid of the pointy bottom. The problem is that the man's silhouette is still quite 18th century long, as it were. The 18th century was all about creating a longer waisted silhouette. Then how do you do that with a straight bottomed waistcoat? Well, basically what you end up with is waistcoats that are cut off at the bottom, but very long, and they sort of make men look like worms or snakes. It's a really unflattering look. You can pull it off and it's all right, but it's not the world's most flattering look.
I don't know if this is just what survives, but I always feel like I love 1780s embroidery in particular, because I feel like that's when the embroidery gets really fun.
I think you're right. In terms of things getting super psychedelic, so previously, the way to be psychedelic, it was just in the fabric, and you had things like bizarre silks and crazy silks of the 1720s and 1730s, 1740s, and then you go through a period where it's all about braid design. And then it turns into that thing of, okay, we've been embroidering for decades now. How can we, push the boat out? And people are looking for just craziness, because things have gone crazy. And it's like, yeah, flowers are nice, but what if I put like a lobster and a fish? Because before it was like, it's the royal court thing. What's in fashion is floral and everything, because that's what the court likes. There's now no court. Well, I really like mushrooms. How much do you like mushrooms? A lot. Okay, I want an embroidered, mushroom waistcoat. Oh, I think it's wonderful. People are showing off on these things. Like there are some, like there's waistcoats where there's musical instruments, but then with music embroidered, or people going, oh, what's this? Oh, I've just covered my waistcoat in hot air balloons. It's like, why? Because we now have hot air balloons, and I love that. it's like people putting memes on t-shirts now. The waistcoat really was the band t-shirt of its day.
Now that I had a better idea of how this waistcoat was supposed to look, I started patterning it out.
Now, as much as I love making a museum replica, I really don't care to look like an elongated torso, or as Zach put it, a worm. So for mine, while I was drafting it, I made it slightly shorter. Yes, it's still below my natural waist, but I made it not quite as long as the original would have been. To draft it, I did my normal thing of drawing the waistcoat lines and 1/8 inch wide tape on my Beatrice dress form, and then traced it out with some pencil. I then cleaned up those lines, added in seam allowances, and then cut it out and made a muslin. You'll notice that in my muslin, I didn't add seam allowances to the neckline or the bottom, so I could evaluate the shape better and evaluate the length without having to imagine it without the seam allowance. Once I decided that I liked it, I loved it. I then scanned it into the computer so I could place the design onto the waistcoat pattern on the computer. I did this using palette 11 Soccer and then broke it down into 4 pieces that I could embroider on my 14x8 inch hoop, since the actual waistcoat panel is much bigger than 14x8 inches. Let's talk about the base fabric. The original waistcoat looks like a silk, satin, and cream. I personally have a favorite silk to embroider on, the double-faced silk Duchess from NewYorkDesignerFabrics.com, which unfortunately costs a ton. Thank you, HelloFresh, but is absolutely a delight to sew with. Due to the thick, tight weave, it embroiders really well, even for designs like this one that have over 70,000 stitches to the repeat. I hooked the fabric onto my frame using a tearaway stabilizer behind it and tightened it really tightly. Afterwards, I started stitching it out on my Baby Lock Venture machine with tire silk threads from Japan. It has over 53 color changes and 25 colors, so it took quite some time, but I really loved how it was coming out. Now, if you look at the original embroidery, it has some beautiful contrast silk along the edges with the leaf and starburst design. I wanted to do the same, so to do that, I used silk taffeta from Silk Baron. I pinned down the silk taffeta, sewed a running stitch to keep it in place, trimmed it with a pair of embroidery scissors, and then used a thicker satin stitch to hide and clean up the edges of the raw silk. This is called appliquing, and it worked beautifully in this instance. I then did this about 4 times for each of the panels. Honestly, it's about 15 hours of embroidery time for each half of the waistcoat, and with the time I spent messing it up, it probably took me close to 45 hours to finish the 2 waistcoat panels. And they're still not perfect, but I've decided that I was happy enough that I could live with it. After this, I had to do the very nerve-wracking thing where I put the pattern onto it, trace it on with friction pen, which disappears with heat, add seam allowances to the edges where I have not put it in before, and then cut it out. I then cleaned up the edges by the satin stitched embroidery by ironing it and then adding 1/2-inch hem tape to tape it down. The hem tape also acts as a stiffener along the edges, which give it some strength. Afterwards, I cut out the lining and sewed it. This is a little odd, but I make my waistcoats a little differently from other people. Originally, waistcoats were sewn with a complete back and with a center back seam, but a lot were made adjustable for size by tearing apart that center back seam and then putting in ties or eyelets as the waistcoats went to other people or the people gained weight. I personally love a waistcoat with a lace-up back so that it could be adjusted for weight changes or blouse thickness, which is so important. So what I will do is make the left half of the waistcoat and the right half of the waistcoat separate from each other and then sew it back together in the back. To do this, I sewed the waistcoat front to the back lining by sewing it together along the side seam. I did the same for the lining pieces with a 1/2-inch seam. You'll notice now I have 4 different pieces for this waistcoat. I then pressed all these seams open and matched up the 2 right sides together. I sewed it along the armhole, the neckline in the back, the center back, and the lining hem. I then ironed all the seams, clipped all the curved edges, and then turned it right side out. I ironed in and matched up the lining along the bottom and the front. I sewed it together with silk threads and tiny stitches. I then made the shoulder seam by pinning away the lining from the shoulder seam and matching up the front and shoulder together for the outer shell. I then seamed it with the machine, then laid the lining cleanly on top of it, folding in the seam allowances. I also sewed this by hand. I then sewed the eyelets in the back. They're not the most even, but I assure you no one will notice. I used 1/4" cotton tape to spiral lace up the back with a tapestry needle once all the eyelets were done. You may recognize the 1/4" tape as the same that I used on the sailor dress, by the way. I love this 1/4" tape and buy this stuff by the roll from Burnley and Trowbridge. It's so versatile. Meanwhile, I designed, digitized, embroidered some buttons. I originally planned on using 1" buttons, but after I actually looked at it more closely, I found them to be too large and decided to use 3/4" buttons instead. I covered each button mold with the silk by cutting the silk with about a 3/4" allowance, gathering it along the edge about a 1/4" away from the button, trimming the excess, and then gathering it up. Afterwards, I tightened up the back of the button by going back and forth, pulling it taut. I made 11 buttons for this waistcoat. For the buttonholes, I use my Baby Lock Soprano buttonhole foot, which I find to be the easiest way to make buttonholes on embroidered silk. I know that many people would do this by hand, but because of the embroidery, I find this incredibly challenging, since anytime you cut the fabric for the buttonholes, it means that you're cutting the satin stitches of the embroidery as well. The machine can do this much better than I can. While I was doing all this, I had my chat with Zack Pinsent and realized I wanted to add additional silk at the neckline so that the collar can kind of puff up. So I spent an additional 6 hours to make 2 neckline pieces. I then cut it out, ironed in the seams, and then pinned them to the front of the neckline and sewed them in, removing the linen lining where there was repeated layers. Finally, I cut out the buttonholes with the buttonhole cutting tool by Clover and then sewed in the buttons where I needed them. And the waistcoat was done. I love this waistcoat. I actually did one for my husband a couple years back and I have no idea where he put it. He lost it. So I am so glad that I have one for me now. If we do find it, I plan on wearing them together and wear them to our next American Eskimo Rescue picnic. But I feel like this can be styled however you want. I've worn this twice now with jeans, also with a blouse and a black skirt so I could see which way. I think I like the skirt way better. One question I get asked is, do I ever wear the clothes I make again? And the answer is a resounding yes. I'm currently in the process of trying to make at least 50% of my wardrobe, and I plan on wearing this waistcoat all the time. Thank you again for joining me on this historical waistcoat trip. If you have an awesome idea for what should go on a waistcoat next, please let me know in the comments. I definitely plan on making more waistcoats. Currently, I am working on 2 different projects. One is the evening gown that Anastasia wears to the Russian ballet, and the other is a Victorian lady doctor suit/dress. So if you've enjoyed this video, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe so you can see more sewing content. By the way, I get a ton of questions about what I'm wearing for every video. Today, I am wearing a floral dress, which I got from Linen Naive, which I've linked below, and I love their dresses because they're just so flowy and pretty and they make me feel so feminine.